So it's a hand-me-down.
I knew Tom was cool before, but I didn't know he was cool like this.
All right,
So I must have Linux.
straight to the point.
That's a Linux.
6:02. Call to order the committee of the whole. We don't even have a roll call on here, so let's just get started. Mr. City Administrator.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor. Members of the Common Council, we are gathered here on the very last day of July, 2017, to kick off the budget planning process for the fiscal year 2018 budget. So as we are now 7 months through the fiscal year, we're going to walk you through some information that was contained in the packet that went out to all of you last Thursday as kind of a pre-step to kicking off our efforts on the staff side as we begin to develop a draft budget, which will be before you probably the first week of October. I think the schedule in the packet indicated October 6th or thereabouts. And from there, we have included several dates in the packet that we'd like to cover at the end of tonight's discussion regarding potential dates for the Appropriations Committee, those nights that would be favorable to the group as a whole for considering the draft budget that we'll be bringing before you in October. And as indicated in the packet, we have to have an approved budget by no later than October 23rd to meet the statutory requirements for publishing the budget notice and the public hearing notice. And as has been the council's practice in the past, the public hearing and the formal adoption of the budget occurs at the first meeting of the council in November, which this year falls on November 14th, the very last day that we could, or the latest that a second Tuesday could fall during the month. So we're on a schedule. Staff has begun putting together their respective departmental budgets. The budget parameters went out to staff last week. And what we want to do here tonight is engage in a higher level discussion with all of you relative to the information that was contained in the packet so that we can get a better sense of what your expectations are as we work to craft that budget for 2018. So let's kind of take it away, Tom. And as part of the preparation discussion, we're going to be talking about debt management and how we're going to manage our debt going forward, capital planning and how we want to approach that in a very philosophical way. The use of general fund balance, as the council will recall, we used $700,000 of fund balance in the 2017 budget. That is creating some impacts for the staff as we go into 2018. We want to kind of get a sense of the council relative to that, and then we'll run you through quickly some other considerations, some of the information we know, some of the information we don't know at this point, given that it's still July. And then we'll look to you to give us some direction relative to how you'd like us to proceed as we put the budget together. So let's keep going here, Tom, and begin with a budget recap of 2016. Let's go back one slide. There you go.
There.
Nope. In July, the council adopted the comprehensive annual financial report. And as discussion had it at Finance and Personnel, we have gotten to a point where we are very tight with our budgeting. And if you look at the results from 2015, revenues were about $110,000 over what we budgeted, and we did a good job of managing our expenditures to the tune of almost $125,000 below budget. So when we budgeted $300,000 worth of fund balance for 2015, we wound up using only $68,000. Fast forward to 2016, we also budgeted $300,000. Our revenues came in just below what was budgeted by just less than $7,000. Expenditures again were below budget, and we had to use $222,000 worth of fund balance. So as you can see, in 2015 to 2016, we're within 1% on both revenues and expenditures. And so we're budgeting very tightly, and we're doing our very best to adhere to the spending plan that you have adopted over 2015 and 2016. Next slide, Tom. Go back, please. Next one. Okay. Here's the revenue trend for the last 10 years. And as you can see, and this was included in the packet, taxes have gone down as a percentage of the overall budget by about 0.5%. And that still comprises our major revenue source, very stable revenue source on behalf of the city. You can see our licenses and permits have become a bigger part of our budget. Public charges for services have become a bigger part of our budget, and we've really taken a hit on investment income over the last 10 years due to the low interest rate environment. Now taking a look at expenses over the last 10 years, you can see that we've really seen growth in really one area of our operating budget, and that's public safety. We've gone up just over $1 million in expenditures on a 10-year time frame, but the percentage of public safety expenditures as a whole relative to the budget has declined from about 36% down to 26%. You can see that public works and general government, those overall expenditures have declined from 4.6 million down to 3.3 million for public works. General government has gone down about $550,000. General government comprises only 9% of the budget, or comprised 9% of the budget in 2016. It was near 20% 10 years ago.
Aren't these percentages skewed because of a one-time capital expenditure in 2016 that's non-recurring and unlikely to ever happen again?
That being the public works facility?
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, when you go from 5% to 34%, $10 million of capital expenditures, and that isn't a recurring expense.
No, that is not, and that is correct, Alderman Worth. We did have a rather large number for capital in the 2016 budget due to the borrowing and the expenditure of funds for the DPW facility. But as you can see below, our debt service 10 years ago was just over 1.1 million. Now we're at 3.5 million, and that includes the TID debt service. Without TID, we're at about 3.1.
3.1.
And how much is it without the DPW building?
Well, it's an $8.9 million project. I don't think we spent all of that, obviously, in 16, so maybe half of it is DPW related. The rest is roads, et cetera.
We have debt coming off next year, MMSD. The sewer war.
The sewer board,
Yeah,
the flow settlement.
That's a huge
right?
chunk. That comes off.
But that's paid for by sewer utility customers, not GEO.
I don't
Okay.
think that's in here, because that's
So
what
that
0.7
wouldn't,
million.
that's not included in that debt service.
Correct. Yeah.
So,
Okay, so we've looked at 2016. Now we'll fast forward to 2017. These charts were also in your packet. We won't spend a lot of time on them. But from a revenue standpoint, we're tracking in line with normal cyclical expectations relative to our major revenue sources for 2017. You can note a couple of our smaller revenue areas, DPW fees, development fees, and other revenue are tracking a little below what we would expect to see at this point of the year. We're going to continue to track that, but overall our revenues are about 57% as of the midpoint in 2017. So we're encouraged by that.
But what would you expect, I mean, because revenues are not done on a monthly basis, and it's hard to tell, year-to-date percentage doesn't mean anything to me. Is that where you would expect to be at 57%, or would you expect to be at 65% other years of your revenues, or 45%?
Yeah, there's more detail in your packet.
Yeah,
where
I
it's
tried to
got-
follow that.
Where it's got previous years,
Yeah.
and in absolute dollar amounts, it's pretty consistent with, let's say, 16.
Okay.
A big chunk of the other revenue line is the fund balance for 700,000. For 700K is included in that other revenue line, so that's, you know, a major reason why we haven't
Right.
gotten to 50% or so.
Okay.
Okay, moving on to expenditures, year-to-date for 2017. We're up in a couple of categories near the top of the page. The mayor and council looks like it's way over budget, but a lot of those expenses relate to the festivities, Memorial Day, 4th of July, Fun Before the 4th. All of those monies are accounted for in the mayor and the council's budget. So that's just a matter of accelerated spending during the first 6 months of the year. We've also had some turnover on the council, and sometimes that requires a little additional expenditure in terms of farewell for the former members and then getting the newer members up to speed. So we're not concerned about that number over the long term. I think our spending will decelerate as we head into the second part of the year. Finance, I think that number is red because we've paid ahead on our insurance.
Yeah, we've paid the premiums for the year for liability and other insurances, and the chargeback for that to the using departments happens at year end.
And I'll note one last development on this chart. You can see we've already paid 3/4 of our share to the library through the first 6 months of the year. So that's at 75% of a rather large expenditure line item. And even with that advanced funding of the library, we're still well below 50% for expenditures at the midpoint of the year. So we think we're tracking well on expenditures, and we're hoping that that trend continues throughout the remainder of 2017. In terms of the guiding principles that have governed staff's approach and the council's approach to putting forth the budget and considering the budget on an annual basis, obviously maintaining a stable tax rate and low taxes, a low property tax rate is a foremost priority that staff understands that the council would like to see continued moving into this budget process. Through the years, it's also been to improve and enhance the city's infrastructure and long-term assets, and we've seen that through the approach, the aggressive approach to our road program over the last 10 years or so. Providing excellent public safety services is also a major priority, and then expanding the tax base, which is related to maintaining a stable tax rate through a strategic and balanced approach to economic development. And by expanding the tax base, we're broadening the amount or the number of taxpayers, which helps to maintain our tax rate. And if we look at that another way, next slide, Tom, investing in a safe community through public safety and investing in the city's infrastructure supports or puts in place the foundation within a community for a growing economy, and a growing economy through an expanding tax base helps to maintain a stable cost of living. In terms of the 4 identified priorities of the council, I think it's helpful to kind of just take a look back over the last couple of years to see how we furthered some of those objectives and some of the programs and some of the deliverables that have made its way through this council and have been driven from a staff level. We've implemented emergency medical dispatch, which has improved the patient outcome for many of the folks that are calling 911. We've put in place an intern program, a very low-cost and creative approach to helping us staff our fire department during some of the summer months of the year. Our ISO rating has improved to a 4, which keeps insurance rates down for both businesses and homeowners. We've invested in lots of police equipment, new SUVs, new automatic external defibrillators. We've replaced all of our rifles. We've purchased body cameras, and we've replaced our squad cameras. We've purchased a new pumper and a new ambulance over the last 3 years. The council authorized a new police officer position for 2017, and we have a staffing analysis underway for both police and fire. So when we say that public safety is a priority for the council, you look right up here, and that's very much the case, given what we've been doing in that realm. From an infrastructure standpoint, some of the accomplishments over the last couple of years have included the establishment of a CIP program to address major and secondary drainage issues throughout the community. We've invested $5.7 million in road maintenance and improvements over the last 3 years, and we're in the 3rd and final year of that road borrowing. We've extended sewer service to the central growth area. We've expanded the water utility by over 530 customers into the village of Bayside. Our combined DPW facility will result in us, the city, shrinking our footprint by 3 facilities if you combine the sewer shop here on Mequon Road, the water department over on Green Bay Road, and the fact that we pulled out of the Logaman Center and we're now considering the reuse of that property, that's going to help us maintain our operational expenses long-term from a facility perspective. And as we all know, the East Trunk sewer design is currently underway. So we've talked about public safety, we've talked about infrastructure. From an economic development perspective and broadening the tax base, some of our accomplishments have included the phased development of 150-plus homes in the central growth area. We've completed Mequon Town Center 1, and that's fully operational. We've re-engineered a couple of positions within the Community Development Department to support the higher level of permit activity that we're experiencing across the board. And we've also leveraged an existing position which wasn't really fully employed to put us in a better position to continue to be strategic by adding another staff or converting an existing staff position to a long-range planning position. We recently, this year, approved MTC Phase 2, which should be breaking ground here over the next couple of months. And other projects listed on the screen, I won't read through them, but these are all major residential, commercial, mixed-use, healthcare facility projects that are going to help continue to expand our tax base and help us manage the tax rate long-term. Our new construction value in 2016 exceeded 80 million. I have not seen that figure in a past audit of the city over the last 15 years. That could be the highest number for construction value in the history of Mequon. Don't quote me on that, but I have yet to see a number that high. So
What's the percentage of the overall value of the city? What's the total value of,
Well, the city is 4.5 billion, so that is slightly less than what, 2%? 1.7?
okay.
So we're doing a lot of great things in the economic development realm to continue to grow and broaden that tax base, which at the end of the day helps us maintain that stable tax rate. And if we look at what we've done on a fiscal sustainability standpoint, or a fiscal stewardship standpoint, in 2015, our assessor left. And so we were in a position where we had to pivot quickly and bring in an assessor, and we hired Grota Appraisals. And through the remainder of the 2015 and the 2016 year, they captured a lot of value that we had not been previously capturing through the former assessor. And we realized 115 million in new assessed value through the end of 2016. Over the last 2 budget cycles, we've reduced recurring expenses in the general fund across all operating departments by nearly $500,000. We established a capital reserve fund last year as part of the approval of the 2017 budget, and we've got a small amount of money that we're hoping to continue to build to address some of our longer-term needs. More recently, we've had a 4-level jump in our water utility bond rating to a AA, and we recently approved the resolution saving $1.25 million in savings for the water customers. And over the last couple of years, we've earned 2 additional awards from GFOA for our comprehensive annual financial report, which is the audit, and a skinny down version, which is the popular annual financial report, which is a user-friendly version that's available on the city website. Kind of breaks down the density of the audit into user-friendly terms. So here's a slide, kind of going through our priorities. Here's a slide that we shared with the council 2 years during budget. And this was my take, sort of, as the new city administrator, on those steps that the city might want to consider in terms of maintaining fiscal sustainability over the long term. And these strategic initiatives were listed in no particular order, but you can see the bolded areas are the areas that we're going to be talking a little bit more about tonight as we get into the guts of the presentation here in a moment. And that's to eliminate deficit budgeting, which we've been doing over the last couple of years. And I'm not going to make an editorial comment on that. It's appropriate to use excess fund balance to maintain stable tax rates. And the best practice from GFOA included in your packet indicates as much. So but we've got a deficit going into next year, and we've got to figure out how we're going to grapple with that. Strengthening the city's financial cash position is related to debt service and deficit budgeting. the fund balance and eliminating deficit budgeting. Strengthening our financial position or our cash position gives us flexibility to take advantage of opportunities in the future and to maintain stable tax rates. Developing and implementing a long-term debt strategy. Tom Watson is going to kind of walk you through some of the scenarios that he's been working on over the last several weeks. And then we've kicked off an asset management plan to look at all of our facilities. We've got the DPW facility that's just nearing the end of its construction, and we're going to have a ribbon cutting ceremony here in probably September. And then we're going to be evaluating all of our equipment replacement policies and plans and the life cycle of our equipment through the asset management plan as well. So this is just kind of a way to kind of circle back to some of the keys or the strategic initiatives that I shared with you 2 years ago, and to demonstrate that we're going to be talking about some of these here tonight as it relates to the 2018 budget. So we mentioned that we're going to get into a discussion about capital financing and debt planning, and that's really one of the two major thrusts of tonight's meeting and tonight's discussion. From a capital financing perspective, the city has utilized a combination of pay-as-you-go and debt financing to fund our capital expenditures over the last 10 plus years. And we started borrowing to fund road maintenance and improvements back in 2007. As noted in the packet, our average annual investment has been at about $1.7 million per year. And our 2015 road issue, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be tapped out at the end of this year. We use a pay-as-you-go approach to fund our vehicles and our equipment and some special projects like emerald ash borer or secondary and major drainage issues. Last year that came in just around $850,000 a year. So we use a combination of both pay-as-you-go and debt financing to fund our capital expenditures. In terms of our road program, just a couple of quick stats or factoids for the council. Our surface condition rating has improved demonstrably since we took a more aggressive approach to funding our road program. As you can see on the screen, we've gone from 6.4 to 6.8 in terms of a condition rating on our subdivision roads, and more significantly, we've gone from a 5.7 average rating all the way to a 6.8 in 2017 along our main roads. You can see that our road mileage has increased by about 45 lane miles from 1984 to 2016, and asphalt prices have continued to climb over the last 20 years. We're now paying more than double what we paid 20 years ago. Last year, during the budget process, the decision was made to eliminate funding for bike lane construction as part of our pay-as-you-go capital approach moving forward. Staff?
It was on a case-by-case basis. It was to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So it wasn't going to be eliminated. It was going to be evaluated on a case-by-case
We
basis.
didn't budget any money for it.
We didn't budget for it, but we didn't choose to eliminate it going
Well-
forward.
So if we want to build bike lanes, we build less roads in that year.
Yeah,
But it still needs to come forward for consideration with each.
that's not what he said.
That's what I understood, sorry.
Well, we currently have no money in the budget, in the budget for bike lane funding. I think we took that fund down to zero, and we utilized the proceeds that were sitting in that fund. But as indicated on the screen, in the future, or our approach going forward is going to be combining bike lanes, and staff is even proposing some parking lots into future road improvement programs so that we can not only continue to improve our roads, but also address bike lane funding and parking lots as we move forward. So that's one point for consideration. In terms of the DPW facility, just to refresh the council's memory, we approved the borrowing for this. As Tom mentioned earlier, it was about $8.9 million. We borrowed this money in March of last year. The term of the bond is for 15 years, and it'll be paid off in 2031. The tax rate impact, as we demonstrated to the council as we worked up to the budget adoption last year, was about 15 cents. And the average debt service impact on a year-over-year basis during the 15-year life of that bond is just under $700,000 a year. And we absorbed that debt service without adjusting the tax rate to pay for this debt that was issued last year. So that was a major hurdle for the staff to work through, but working collaboratively with the council over several meetings last fall, we were able to get to a point where we were in a position to absorb that debt service without an adverse effect or a 15-cent effect on the tax rate. In terms of parks and open space, just a quick update, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about parks and open space, but just a reminder, the Parks and Open Space Fund was created in 1989. It can be used for acquisition of parkland and improvements to existing parks to create parks. It's funded by impact fees, which are equivalent to $900 per dwelling unit. That can be a home, that can be an apartment, that can be a condominium. As I mentioned, it can be used for improvements to existing parks, but it cannot be used for repairs. Presently, and as I think has been shared with the council in previous discussions, the fund is negative and is actually working its way towards coming into the black. Right now, we're at about $68,000 in the hole, and we expect that to be positive or cash flow positive by 2018, given some of the development trends that we're seeing here in the city. And those monies would be available as we develop a fund balance in the fund to address items that the Park Board identified through the adoption of the Parks and Open Space Master Plan, which was put together in 2014. So right now, not a great story because we don't have a lot of money to play with, but if we continue to direct efforts towards broadening the tax base and strategically approaching economic development opportunities, we should have some money in this fund in 2018, 2019, and 2020 to help us address maybe some of the deferred maintenance in our parks or some opportunities to expand offerings within our parks without hitting the property tax rate or the general fund budget. So just a little information as kind of an FYI. Let's keep rolling, Tom.
How negative was it? It's minus 68 now. How much has it rebounded?
400,000 at one point, negative.
Do we know when that was, Tom?
Well, it was after the purchase of the property to the east. I can't think of the name.
Build a
The
Park?
owner.
Build a Park.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Aren't there two funds we're working at here? One is to purchase open space and the other is for parks.
Right, the
Open
open
space
space
fund was
fund
decimated,
was cleared out in
Yeah.
that purchase.
so we may get some of that back.
We
That's
may.
separate from the fund that's funded by the $900
Correct.
a unit.
Correct. To be determined. So we talked a little bit before about the asset management plan. And as noted last year during the development of the budget, the Government Finance Officers Association recommends development of a multi-year financing plan, and this is what we're going to be talking about here in a couple of minutes, for the capital improvement program to ensure that it is achievable with expected available resources. As mentioned last year, it is a strategic integrated approach to managing infrastructure and assets over the long term. And as was further explained last year, it not only gives us an opportunity to assess the current condition of all of our capital assets, which are approaching about $100 million in value, but it's also going to give us an idea of how are we doing in terms of managing those assets across our various operating departments, mainly Public Works and Public Safety. An asset management plan will be a comprehensive look at all of our asset classes, including buildings, facilities, roads, bridges, parking lots. You can see it all listed there on the screen. So we want to get our arms around all of our assets to understand exactly what the financial ramifications are relative to those properties. And the approach that we've been taking, and this has been explained to the council through the Public Works Committee last month and through the weekly bulletin, we have $25,000 budgeted in 2017 to develop the plan. As staff was putting together the approach to pursue this, it was determined that a three-phased approach across the three major asset classes might make the most sense, because we not only want to leverage specific expertise relative to facilities, infrastructure, and our rolling stock, We also want to assess how we're managing those various asset classes. How is our facilities division doing in terms of managing our buildings? What are the maintenance cycles? What are the life cycle costs of the equipment? What are the replacement cycles? Are they appropriate? Are we replacing squad cars too quickly? Are we replacing public works vehicles too quickly? We need to understand that and assess that relative to industry norms. As an example, and as was discussed at Public Works Committee earlier this month, we currently budget almost $750,000 a year for operations in our facilities division, and we're only budgeting $200,000 for capital. Now, I'll point out, of that $200,000, $135,000 is the long-term capital reserve fund that we established last year as part of the budget process. So when you subtract that from the $200,000 amount, we've got about $65,000 going to building repairs and capital upgrades. Relative to our operations, that's an imbalance from staff's perspective. We want to understand that better so that we're making good, judicious decisions relative to the resources that are included in the budget and that we need to maintain these systems. As was indicated earlier this month, the RFP for the facilities study was distributed July 12th. We had 7 individuals in this room last Thursday taking a 3.5-hour site tour of all of the facilities and buildings included in that RFP, and the deadline for proposals will be August 18th, next month. Staff is in the process of developing the RFP for infrastructure, which is going to measure all of our roads, bridges, and associated transportation system appurtenances. And then fleet and major equipment, we're hoping to have that RFP out on the street by no later than November of this year. All in, we expect to have all 3 reports available during the first quarter of 2018. That's going to give us really good data in terms of how we're going to make decisions over the next couple of years in planning capital and managing our debt.
We discussed this in October or November of last year, yet we only sent out the first RFP in June, and now we don't have the reports available for this budget. How come?
Well, we're also doing a police and fire staffing analysis across 2 departments.
Right.
And we're also doing a parking study, which wasn't necessarily in the work plan for this year. I got to be honest with you, I don't know how many studies we can manage at once and keep them all moving forward at the pace that we need to. Some of these efforts are rather staff intensive in terms of gathering information, coordinating surveys, coordinating site visits, pulling together budget histories and so forth. There's a certain level of support that we need to provide to the consultant that's selected or to the selection process that we need to go through in order to recommend a vendor to the council. As an example, I think we had 10 firms that submitted proposals for the public safety staffing analysis. Well, the mayor knows that was a pretty thick pile of proposals that we needed to go through in order to make a recommendation to the council in terms of who we thought was the best firm to perform that study. That takes some time to do. Okay, so now we're going to sort of get into the meat and potatoes of tonight's discussion, and we're going to talk about borrowing versus pay as you go. And as Tom, I think, mentioned earlier in the discussion, and as is included in the packet, we are now approaching $600,000 in interest on our general obligation non-TID debt. And we think at a staff level, that's a significant amount of money, as you can see on the screen, dead money, that might be available if we can reimagine how we're funding our capital on a debt-financed basis. Our debt service cost, as was shown on the slide earlier, has increased from about $1 million to $3.2 million annually. And as Tom mentioned, we're probably going to be borrowing about $10 million next year and the following year as we break ground on the 2018 East Trunk Sewer project. And other than the DPW borrowing, and we just talked about this in the asset management discussion, the city's not currently funding facility improvements. And so what we want to do is engage in a discussion tonight about potential funding options or scenarios whereby we can unwind from the road borrowing program that we've been on in order to leverage that interest cost that is not really getting us anything other than pushing our costs into the future. And why this is so important relative to the 2018 budget is because we absorbed that $688,000 in debt service for the Public Works facility as part of last year's budget adoption. But we are now at a point where if we continue to borrow for roads, and Tom's going to get into this in a minute, if we continue to borrow for roads and go out to market again to do a $5.7 million issue in 2018, that's going to create additional debt service obligations that I'm having a hard time understanding how we're going to pay for if we're unwilling to adjust the property tax rate. I think we've hit the wall in terms of our debt service capacity relative to general obligation debt and relative to the general fund within the budget. And I don't know that we can keep going forward and borrowing for roads as we've done in the past, given that we've got the DPW facility now in the debt service queue and the other facility needs that I think we're going to have to discuss and to wrestle with as we move forward. You talk about the pool, you talk about the City Hall parking lot relative to a potential redevelopment of the Logoman Center. We've got some capital needs. We need to figure out a way to pay for it. And so some of the input that I've gotten over the past 2 evaluation cycles is to look at creative approaches for funding needs and addressing priorities of the council in creative ways. And what Tom is going to do, and as he's done throughout the packet, is put together some scenarios that we want to introduce tonight. We don't necessarily need a decision, but we'd kind of like to get a sense or take your temperature relative to whether or not this is something you'd like us to maybe do some more work on with our financial advisor, Ellers, to bring back to you as we go forward in the budget process. So Tom, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you can kind of walk us through this.
Thanks. So just to start off with some of the assumptions I made to try to get to these 4 different models that we're going to be looking at in a minute are that just underneath all of this is the assumptions that we're ignoring inflation. We assume that the rates that we borrow for in 2018 or 2019 are going to be the same rates that we can get in 2028 or 2032. I assumed for a growth factor conservatively of 1% every year starting in 2018 and beyond. And as Will said, we're not looking for a decision per se, but really, what is your preferences going forward? Do you want to stay on the path that the city's been on lately with borrowing for roads and for road maintenance? Or do we want to explore how to reallocate our limited resources for other worthy projects? So in your packet, you've got these fairly wide spreadsheets that have each of these 4 options, and I won't go through that tonight. It's hard to read on a big screen. So I just wanted to recap by looking at just a select number of years to make it a little bit easier to work through these models. So each of the 4 models we're looking at tonight are going to show something from 2011, 5 years basically from 2016, last year, the current year, next year, and then 5 years after that, 5 years after that. So under the status quo model, we borrow 5.1 million, which is 1.7 a year for 3 years. We borrow every 3 years to fund the next 10-year bond, and we keep doing that cycle through the end of this model. So in 2027, we would borrow 5.1 again, assuming it gets us just as much road construction as it does today, and that that debt issue would be paid off in 2036. Each of the models have basically the same amount that we'd fund for sinking funds. So in 2011, we put away $912,000. 2017, the current budget year, $848 includes the amount that we put away for a sinking fund for city facilities. The other models are going to talk about ways to maybe the city could start self-funding some of its roads rather than borrowing 100% for roads and maintenance. And the current status quo model doesn't have any money dedicated towards city facilities. So the subtotals are at near the bottom there. The value of the city, you can see over time has been growing from about 4.3 billion. This year we're just under 4.5 billion. I used that as a base for 2018, and then I started growing that by 1% every year. Thanks.
So if you're doing estimated values going forward based on historical trends, why not factor in the same kind of analysis for the cost of roads? I mean, assuming that roads aren't gonna cost any more
Right.
in 2028 than they do today is probably not a very realistic assumption. And somewhere we need to be looking at what are the costs of roads going to be going forward,
Sure.
just as you're doing it with the value in the mill rate.
Yeah, I wanted the discussion to really focus on the choices between it and not really worry about inflation, because I think we can all understand current year dollars and not have to worry about, well, is that a good inflation factor for the year 2032?
Okay,
None of us will be here in 2032 to
Dan will,
understand.
but
Dan will, right?
Dan's not going anywhere.
And if we were to move forward on maybe extrapolating some of the work that Tom has done here on a staff level, I think we would take those very factors into consideration and do a more sophisticated analysis and bring that back to the council. But this
Okay.
is really for illustration purposes, and we want to kind of keep it simple and basic. I'll point out this number right here. And I mentioned we absorbed the debt service for the DPW facility without a corresponding increase in the tax rate from 2016 to 2017. This number here, 4 million for debt service and sinking fund capital, I think that's probably our Mendoza line, so to speak, in terms of a target for debt service, for road maintenance and facilities funding and working capital. That's probably a number that we should keep in mind looking forward in terms of maintaining as a part of the overall budget. Because if that number gets bigger, then we're cutting expenditures somewhere else. If that number gets smaller, we're probably not doing enough. But I think we've done the hard work over the last couple of years to get to a point where we may have equilibrium at 4 million per year, a $4 million investment across the city's asset classes. And our challenge going forward will be to decide what is the appropriate number for sinking funds, what is the appropriate number for facilities, and what is the appropriate number for roads and other associated transportation systems. Because to go higher than 4 and not raise the tax rate, all we're gonna be doing is scalloping out of the general fund budget, and that's gonna be hitting the departments, police, fire, and public works. And that's where the majority of our expenses are. It's not in administration, it's not in finance, it's not in general government. So just keep that number in mind. Tom, you want to show them the other 3 scenarios?
Sure. So that's pretty much what the city's been doing if we continue on this path. I tried to do some smoothing to stay around that 4 million line that Will mentioned. So even in 2028, we're roughly about the same amount that we were 10 years prior. The next version is consider going to more of a self-funding. So the city would supplement borrowings with tax levy dollars, similar to what we did in the early 2000s through 2007 or so, where the city was putting aside or dedicating significant tax levy dollars towards its own road construction program. Obviously, with levy limits, either self-imposed or state-imposed, the city had to find ways to stay with those levy limits, and the road program is one of those programs that we decided to move away from self-funding. But in this scenario, instead of borrowing 5.1 million for 3 years, we'd borrow 3 million for 3 years, and we would do that for two borrowing cycles, 2018 and 2021. By that time, we would start phasing in levy dollars to supplement what's been borrowed. And the packet's got how much would actually be spent on roads, how much would be spent on maintenance that would be city funded. In addition, we would start funding our own facility repairs. So I've put in a number to be level of about $500,000 for each of the next 10 years, starting in 2023. The value obviously is the same for every model, and you can see that if we had these side by side, there is a fairly good bump in 2023 and 2028, but that $4 million line was a goal to try to stay near that number, at least in the 5 immediate years.
And as you can see, if I can just jump in, Tom has taken up these numbers here. The sinking funds has been averaging about 850. Now it's at $1 million, and here it's at 1.7. But if you took that down to 900 or $1 million as opposed to 1.7, you'd see a corresponding drop in that number closer to the 4 million. So we show this for illustration purposes, maybe from an inflationary perspective. But if we're serious about maintaining a level debt service, which some municipalities do as a part of their policy, in order to maintain a stable tax rate, we could play around with these numbers. But again, these numbers are all interdependent relative to whatever we decide the ceiling might be from a policy perspective.
But don't you need to look at this, looking at the actual larger chart that shows what we're actually going to spend on? We're going from 1.7 million a year, which is what the city's been spending for a while, to down to 1.2 and 1.50 thousand going forward, at least for a few years. Isn't that really what this proposal is doing?
Right, but that also includes another $350,000 for maintenance. So when you add those two up, that's not quite a big of a haircut as we might think originally.
Because right now, what we're doing is we're borrowing not only for road improvements, but road maintenance.
Right.
So when we're doing crack sealing,
Understand.
we're doing GSBA 88 sealing, we're actually paying interest to do
But
that.
don't we, to do the analysis I mean, this is all fine, we're analyzing dollars, and dollars are fine, but don't we also need to couple that with an analysis of what the impact is on the service? You know, yeah, the SCR or whatever they're called, ratings have gone up over the last several years, but to maintain that, what would that cost in today's dollars? Or how much of a decrease are we willing to stomach in order to reshuffle the budget? I mean, I don't know that you can make one decision without understanding, and the memo didn't go into what does the engineering department think the impact of this will be on our road conditions. And so I don't know how you make any sort of decision without having that information along with this information.
Yeah, the memo talks about bringing in engineering based on which one of these 4 models the council is most interested in. I wouldn't say commit to, but at least
But how do you know?
right, and so we would have that analysis done saying if we only spend X number of dollars in 2020, what would our SCR rating look like? And they could help us with that. But given the time crunch and
Right.
the city engineer being on vacation this past week and a half, I couldn't get you those
I'm not
numbers.
being critical, I'm just saying I'm not sure. You know, I studied a little bit the 4 examples you gave, but without knowing whether they would allow for a steady rating or what the drop would be, I don't have any way to make a decision on which one of the 4 is more attractive. I mean,
Well, and to Tom's point, before we devote a lot of staff resources to doing that analysis, we want to make sure the council's okay with the concept in general, and then we can come back through working with Ellers and our engineering department or our engineering staff to provide that deeper dive on some of these
and what I'm saying is I can't know whether I have whether I'm comfortable with any of the approaches without knowing what that would do to the rate. I mean, I think that is at least as important of an analysis as the financial side. is the
Right.
service impact side.
Part of the question's gonna be is the council, there's gonna be some trade-offs, and I would guess that the road condition rating's gonna go down if we fund less. How sensitive is the council gonna be to reduction in road ratings in exchange for funding things like facilities or parking lots or things like that?
Or not having to adjust the tax rate to keep the road rating where it is.
Right.
We're really bumping up against
Right, well, I understand the
the
issue.
ceiling.
I just,
Why don't you run through the other two scenarios quickly here, Tom?
Sure. The next one is, we take a year off, basically, in 2018 from borrowing for roads and doing road construction. We would do road maintenance of about 350,000, but we wouldn't actually do real reconstruction for a year. The trade-off for that is that we would obviously not have a debt issue, and the total funding for debt and capital would actually be down from 2017, and with the commensurate reduction in the tax rate. In exchange for that, we would start self-funding roads in 2018. We would start seed money for that, for self-funding, and then increase that in future years to 2028. We would have virtually 1.6 million worth of self-funding for roads, another 500K for facilities. So that's a one-year holiday from road reconstruction funding. The next year one is the same thing, except we would extend it for 2 years. So we would still do maintenance, but there wouldn't be an actual serious borrowing for roads. We would be backloading the self-funding for roads and facility improvements, just like we did in the previous models. The trade-off for that is obviously that the tax rate for 2018 and I believe 2019, not shown on the screen, would be reduced from some of the other models. Again, there's a trade-off of taxes versus road funding versus competition for limited resources for facilities and things like that.
I would think, I've lived here 17 years now. I think the roads have been outstanding in the city. We had our road redone needlessly where I live. Well, part of it was because they threw asphalt all over it and some stones and pretty much destroyed it, and then we drove over that for a year and a half, wrecking our vehicles. But that road would have lasted probably another 5-6 years before it really needed any maintenance, and now it's completely redone. I would say that, you know, if you took a year off or a year or two off, and then all of a sudden these roads started getting bad, well, then we go back to, we'd find a way to pay for them, but I think some of this stuff may be replaced long before its life expectancy.
without, I mean, one of the issues in deferring road reconstruction is not simply the impact in the years that are there, but it's the how much of a bottleneck are you creating somewhere down the road where you end up with such a large number of threes that you can't continue to do this on your pay-as-you-go with the dollar amounts because you simply deferred reconstructing roads. And also, if you live on a road that's a 3, you don't have the same perspective as other people do about the condition of the roads in Mequon. I mean, if, you know, John and Dan at least have been around long enough that they'd remember, maybe John wasn't here, because Sam Cutler was here. I mean, we had tons of people complaining about the condition of roads at one point in time. We don't anymore, because we got them into some sort of an equilibrium where they're being repaired. Yeah, people end up with a road that's a 3 for a while. They don't really like it, but they know that they can see it coming, that it's going to get repaired. And if all of a sudden you're pushing them all back a couple of years, I don't know what the impact of that is. And maybe it's fine. I just can't know without knowing, you know, are we going to effectively, relatively maintain what we've been doing by this 2-year hiatus, or are we going to end up recreating a big backlog of 3s and 4s that we're going to have trouble digging our way out of based on the funding you're pushing in future years? And without that kind of an analysis, again, I get back to, I think we do have good roads in Mequon. I don't think we did a few years ago.
I just think if you try something and your experience tells you, did it work or didn't it work? And if it didn't work, then you gotta repair the roads. But if you try it for a year and it worked out pretty fine, you say, well, gee, maybe the roads have a longer life expectancy. And try it for another year and they start to deteriorate, well, then we change our tune.
Well, but we know how long they last. I mean, that's not just try it. We've got a lot of history and experience in knowing how long it takes for a road to get to be a 2 or a 3. And we know that there will be, if you defer, because we already have some 3s, if you defer doing some work, you're gonna have more 3s. And that might be okay because, but if the question is, you know, it all goes back to, and we never kind of do this analysis, when you reconstruct road is partly based on how old the roads are. I mean, it's the condition, but you're gonna be able to, you should be able to project how many roads we have that were reconstructed 25 or 27 years ago, because we know that those roads are going to be reaching that, they're at the end of their useful life. I don't know if there's a glut, or maybe, you know, it's based on, you ought to be able to graph out how old roads are and be able to tell kind of, okay, we're getting to that point where we really ought to be able to take a hiatus because we've reconstructed this big bulk that was done, and now we're to a period where there weren't many roads done 27 years ago. I don't know. But are we at a point where there's a monumental amount at that period of time, you know, forthcoming? Well, then maybe that's the wrong time to be saying we're gonna push right back doing road reconstruction, because we know the pile of 3s and 4s is gonna grow greatly. I'm not sure it can just be done on a dollars and cents basis. I think you have to look at the roads and the history of the roads and the age of the roads to figure out what do we have forthcoming over the next few years.
I've always seen the roads in the wetter land areas. At least I have my experience, and I've been only looking at roads now for 62 years. That's how old I am. But those deteriorate faster. The higher and
course.
drier areas, like I said, while we were high and dry, we didn't need any road repair, and we probably wouldn't have for a number of years. So it really should be based on the road, not just every road deteriorates at the same rate. Well,
Well, no, that's true, but that's just drilling down further in that same analysis. How old are the roads? Where are the roads then? But it's, if there have been different times in the history of Mequon where you've had large amounts of residential development, which would lead to large amounts of new roads. I'm guessing that you ought to be able to track when that was and have an idea of what's coming down the pike. But I've never seen that analysis, despite suggesting we ought to be looking at the history going back 2.5 decades ago.
One of the options, like I said in the memo, there's multiple options we could have, but we could have a status quo plus on top of that, fund facilities or other long-term projects. I didn't put that one on the table because frankly, I didn't think this council would be interested in an option like that. We can certainly have that too,
It's a bigger cost.
but I'm not sure if there's a cake and eat it too scenario that we can have here that is gonna make everyone happy for both roads and facilities and other needs that the city has.
And again, the purpose of this exercise, and while it's not perfect, Tom and I will be the first to admit that these are just rough modeling scenarios to illustrate what we're trying to get to. We're paying $600,000 a year on interest currently relative to our debt service. If you extrapolate that over 10 years, that's $6 million of interest. And what we're trying to do, and even if we took a year or two off and we haven't modeled it here, we're trying to get a better bang for the buck that we're spending, and we're trying to better redeploy our existing resources to get further on addressing those capital needs. So long-term, don't quote me on this, but if we were to free up that interest money at $600,000 a year, at some point, we're gonna be able to catch up on roads and probably facilities as well, because we're not paying someone else to buy our bonds.
Unless we have increased costs on roads because they depleted because we only maintained them at a nominal level. I'll mirror what the other aldermen have said, and I'm very comfortable foregoing a couple years of road maintenance, just doing maintenance only. But what I don't want to see is it impact the quality of life of the Mequon resident.
Sure.
And if so, I'm looking for something quantitative so I can effectively make a decision. The budget looks all fine and great, the mill rate, we're looking at the mill rate, trying to keep it at that certain level, but until we know what that impact is, You know, maybe we go on an every other year where we construct something every other year. I don't know, but again, that comes to borrowing. I mean, it's an entangled web of information. It's not just one piece of the puzzle. But I know at the end of today, you're gonna be looking for some sort of direction going into budget. And in order to have those tools to give you that direction, I think we're gonna need to know what's gonna happen to the roads if we forego a year or so of actual construction. You know, what is that bottleneck going to look like? Kristen's warned us about that every single time she's talked to council about roads. Every budget meeting I've brought it up, the exact same question, you know, and the bottleneck has come up. That's been Kristen's argument. Till we know what that analysis is, I'm struggling to give you more input.
Question going backwards to the original decision, what you said, 2007, that borrowing started. Is there any history as far as how that decision came about in the first place? Was it intended to be a 2-year, 3-year deal that was just to get over a certain hump, and then that we've somehow continued on a borrowing process? Or, I mean, history would be helpful.
I could answer that, but let me say, 30 years of perspective with roads, facilities, and the accompanying debt service. Like many other things in life, the numbers go like this. And what we seem to be trying to do here is make them go like this. And I don't know if that reflects reality, if that's a better way to do things or not, but over all these years, we remodeled the library, city hall, a new safety building, we fixed roads, we bought equipment. We really didn't have much of an improvement plan. You know, our staff would say, you know, we really need this, and we really need that, and in a couple of years, we'll probably need this. But we didn't have complicated plans going out 10 years, and we didn't create budgets with numbers that were level and steady. Roads would go up and down. I look at this chart and the percentage, one of these charts, and the percentage of our budget that was dedicated to debt service goes from 5% to 18%, and this starts in 2007. So if you went back into the 80s and followed that number, it would be all over the place, depending on what we thought was important at the time and what we decided to put money into at the time. So just keep that in mind. You know, you want to make everything level and hunky-dory, and it's, you know, you want every day to be 70 and sunny. It ain't gonna work. 10 years ago, we were trying to keep the tax rate the same, like we always did, and the city administrator at the time was struggling with how to do that, and came up with a real simple solution to make it really easy. Instead of spending whatever it was at the time, $1 million on roads, we'd just borrow the money. Bang, we had that thing solved, and we were out of the meeting, we were done. And I kept thinking, we can't do this every year. And of course, we did. Here we are.
Well, let's make it a little bit, the road condition wasn't, the ratings were down after having a couple of years, particularly in about 2003 or 2004, where I think we did about $200,000 worth of road improvements.
Well, the rating system was a new idea.
Yeah, well, back to about 2000.
They invented that.
Well, about 2000, and they didn't
Yeah.
invent it. It comes from other places. But the roads had taken a dip. There were a lot of complaints about roads, and we were faced with both didn't know where to put it in the budget. We needed to get our roads caught up because there was a lot of pressure from the public about bad roads, and interest rates were incredibly low. I mean, that's, you know, the justification, I think, over the last 10 years has been interest rates are low, roads are a 25-year capital asset. Most capital assets in business or anywhere else are paid for over the life of the asset because you have the people who are benefiting from them pay for them, not just the people today. And so there was a justification with interest rates being low for borrowing. It's really not that bad of an approach when rates are low. It becomes a terrible approach when the rates get high, and we ought to anticipate that that's going to happen.
Or if you keep continuing the same thing, even with low interest rates, if you keep on adding to borrowing.
Well, but you can get to a
keep
steady
kicking the
level
can.
amount. You know,
that?
you can
And
get to a steady level amount because you retire as you,
And the other point that you made about
right?
27-year-old roads or 30-year-old roads, well, you know, if you were here in the 80s, you understood that that's when most of the development in the community took place.
Right.
Most of the subdivisions, so those roads.
We've
and
done
I
a
don't-
lot
I
of
don't
that
know the answer.
reconstruction.
Have all those roads been replaced already? And if they have, then we're on the downside.
Well, that's my point.
Yeah, so that's something that we
This
don't.
might be a great time to do it because we might have hit a lot of it. I think there's some roads individuals can
Yeah.
point out that are bad, but we might have gone through the lion's share of that 70s and 80s boom.
I don't know when my road was first paved, but I know it was a 2. They do go that low. My
Right.
road was a 2, and I don't know, it was 8 years ago or something, they repaved it, and I was like, what's wrong with this road? Nothing, except for 1 or 2 potholes, so. But they spent all the money because it was a 2. It's a dead-end road, it doesn't really matter what it's like.
Again, I don't want there to be any I'm sorry.
No, that's all right, go ahead.
Misunderstanding. Tom and I love seeing roads get done as city officials and as folks who are involved in the capital budgeting process, making sure that we're staying on top of our roads and improving them over time in a methodical fashion is a very good thing to do from a policy perspective. But again, we're just trying to bring a creative approach to the discussion in terms of how we might better leverage the current deployment of resources so that we can do even more going into the future.
Except the creativity is simply, don't do it for a while so you don't have interest and then you get rid of the interest. I mean, you know, I don't know what, and maybe maybe that works.
Well,
But-
that's one creative approach, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate the point you made that it was Nathan Check, I think, who came up with the $1.7 million figure, that's what the city needed to pay or expend each year to maintain the condition of the roads. And your other point about interest rates trending low, when the rates are as low as they have been, maybe it's not a bad idea to continue to borrow at those rates. If we were to see the rates rise, stop borrowing at that point. But also,
That becomes
well,
difficult.
here, the other point about that is that our revenue based on interest rates would rise as well. And do we want the two to continue to go together? I would argue no. Let's continue to have our revenues based on interest rates rise, but we don't want to have to borrow as the rates rise. Getting back to your issue about creativity, which I like, we've been kind of just focusing on the road program, and I know that's a major part of our city budget, but are there other aspects of the budget? And I know that we don't want to be talking about salaries, which is, and benefits, which is 70+% of our budget year after year. But are there other areas, not necessarily roads, not necessarily building facilities? We're going to be, you know, done with the Logan Center, which has been a drain. But what other creative methods can the department heads come up with? Have they come up with any other creative methods to reduce our spending?
Well, we work with department heads every year on that same issue, Alderman, and on top of that, Will's kickoff memo that went out to department heads challenged every department head to come up with one new revenue idea. So we engage staff every year as part of this process, trying to either come up with expenditure cuts, which they control a lot better than revenues, but we look at both ends of the income statement, if you will, to try to do more. Frankly, though, taxes are 70% of the budget year in and year out, so that's a big chunk.
Oh, sure, that's a revenue number, and we have the power to increase taxes. We've tried to keep them level and keep them as low as possible. That's an option we have, absolutely, but I still think, and I think everybody here would maintain that there are potential budget cuts somewhere else in the city of Mequon. I don't know what, I don't want to propose one. I think that,
not?
well, I think it rightfully comes from the department heads. And if we had the department's head, we could push them into
But if 70%
arguing.
of the budget is, now, it may be on the labor side where you can save money somewhere.
Maybe.
If 70% of the budget is labor, and you then are saying, but we're not really talking about roads and capital improvements, we gotta set those aside, there's not much left, John. So,
Well, no, there
you know.
could, no, I think there might be. I
Maybe
think there
10%
might
of
be.
the
I mean, we're
budget's
talking, let's,
outside of those.
for an example, somebody over there mentioned the maintenance of the parks being reduced this year. Is that a fact? I mean, have we reduced maintenance in our parks?
No, I got the same
I
number
didn't-
of employees, right?
We're not cutting back on
I'm not
mowing.
aware of any reduced
Well, it's rained
maintenance.
like crazy. So we have twice as much mowing we're doing.
Reduced
Well, maybe.
maintenance levels, other than the fact that, to Alderman Strelchuk's point, we've been cutting grass like gangbusters.
I would think you would. And same way with snow plowing. I mean, you're gonna be plowing,
Yeah.
depending on the weather, and it's hard to budget
Suggesting we cut
for-
out some of
No,
that.
no, 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 no,
Can't cut
no,
out the
no, I'm not
library.
suggesting.
I mean,
I'm-
that's the point.
my- Well, okay.
Somewhere,
I
You
would
know-
like the department heads who have their hands on day-to-day to make some suggestions. Where, if you had, if the council said to you, well, Jones, city administrator, you tell every budget head that they've got to come up with a 1% cut across the board for their budgets. That's one approach we could take. I don't like that approach. I would like to be able to pick and choose from the ideas that the budget departments or department heads offer us and say, what do we think makes sense? As opposed to just saying, okay, we're gonna cut out 1.7 million out of our road program. I mean, that's one approach, obviously, and we've got a 1-year elimination of that 1.7, we got a 2-year option.
It's not entirely 1.7,
Eliminating.
is it?
That's where it
We
talks
keep
about
up the
that
maintenance, we don't,
Oh, sure, you're keeping
Just
up the
stop.
main.
1.4 million.
just stop repaving.
Yeah.
I think you ought to continue to look at, and I know we spent a lot of money on police vehicles. We could come back for this, come back for that, you know. Years ago, a car would last maybe about 5 or 6 years. Now you can get 240, 250,000 miles out of them easy. You don't have to bring them in for tune-ups, you don't have to bring them in. I think a lot of I just would like to have it looked at and see if we aren't replacing vehicles a little too soon, where we could get more of a life out of them. I always drive a Lexus, a nice fancy Lexus. You know what I pay for those things? $10,000 to $12,000, because I buy every one with 100,000 miles on them, and I run them to 250,000. They don't rust, and I don't have problems with them. Those cars last forever. Today, the automobile industry is building these cars. You don't go back, and you don't have to have tune-ups, and you have fuel injection, and they last and last and last with just a little bit of maintenance. So I don't think we need brand-new vehicles. That's one way to take a look at it. and say, you know,
Absolutely.
maybe this is, plus, we did spend a lot of money, so maybe that, going forward, we won't be spending that much in the next few years on those types of things. I mean, the three main things are roads, police, and fire. We make sure that we have those things covered, but we can also have efficiencies in those areas.
Well, just to get back to that very point, Alderman Garrell, the intent of these asset management studies across facilities, infrastructure, and fleet, and to your point, Alderman Hawkins, as well, we not only want to evaluate the asset condition, we want to evaluate our operations as well. And I use the example of we're budgeting almost $750,000 to run our facilities, staff them, manage them with supplies, contract services, all of our daily operating expenses, and yet our capital number is way below that. So we want to take that approach to see if there's ways to leverage savings on the operating side. I agree wholeheartedly.
No, I appreciate what you,
We're also doing it on the police and fire staffing analyses. They're not only looking at staffing, they're looking at our operations relative to national benchmarks and industry standards to see if there's a better or more efficient way we can do things. Do we need to pay a sworn officer, such as a sergeant or a captain, to do certain administrative duties that could be handled by a much lower compensated position, like an admin assistant or an executive assistant? Those are some of the feedback we're gonna get back from this study that's coming next month, and that we'll be able to look at, among other things.
That's good. Then we'll be able, in October, to be able to say, okay, instead of 1.7 million on roads, we're gonna spend 300 on maintenance, but maybe we could add an additional 200, 400, because you've come up with all these savings, or staff has come up with all these savings from those areas you're talking about, which is great. I applaud that.
And that leads us into the next part of the discussion, which is fund balance. And to kind of pivot here and switch gears, by way of background, back in 2009, the city had a negative outlook on its general obligation bond rating after rebuilding, or eliminated a negative outlook after rebuilding its fund balance, which had dipped down to 6%. Our financial advisor, Ellers, has informed us, and this is not information that has not been shared with the council previously, that our fund balance has been historically below our peers. We're going to be assessed again in 2018 as we go forward to borrow for the East Trunk Sewer Project in 18, 19, and possibly even 20, depending on the scope and the cost of the project. They'll be looking at our present fund balance amount, and if we're using fund balance, to balance our annual budget. So just sharing this information for information purposes. Currently, our city policy relative to fund balance is a minimum of 10% and not more than 15%. GFOA, as we've shared with you previously and in the packet, recommends 2 months at minimum in terms of reserves, which is equivalent to 16.7%. Our beginning fund balance in 2017 is up at about 18.4%. And if we use the full $700,000 that we've budgeted to achieve a balanced budget here in 2017, we'll be at 14.1% at the end of the year. That's equivalent to about $2.2 million.
$2.2 million, right.
In unassigned
Unassigned.
fund balance at the end of this year. And why is this important? Well, going into the 2018 budget, Tom, next slide, this creates a bit of a conundrum for staff, because if we just assume for a moment, and we're assuming that expenses remain level and they don't increase at all from 17 until 18, we have a revenue gap of $700,000 that we're going to need to fill in order to match just a level of expenditures that was approved for 2017. So as we used $700,000 of fund balance here in 2017 to balance the budget between revenues and expenditures, we are now in a hole equivalent to $700,000 for 2018. So we've got to make up that difference.
And you believe we'll use the full 700,000? I mean, it looks like things are trending less than expenditures than budgeted. So won't we actually add to the fund balance in all likelihood?
Well, you remember at the top of the conversation, 2015 and 16 ended up within 1% of revenues and expenses. So if we hold that again, maybe we'll use only 600,000, but it will,
That's
Real
real
low.
low.
That's significant.
maybe,
Your fuel cost savings has to be decent. in
or
last-
maybe we have a bad fall coming up with winter, early winter,
Sure, I-
and we blow it. So I'm not sure.
So this is one of the factors that we're up against as we go into 2018. How are we going to bridge that gap, so to speak?
And what would our fund balance be at if we maintained our policy of 10%, but went to 10%?
600,000 down, another 600,000.
That might make up the difference, or almost all of the gap.
So to translate the question and the answer that you two just engaged in, we've got about $600,000 in fund balance at the end of the year, assuming everything works out budget-wise, that could be used to kind of fill this gap and still maintain our 10% policy. Is that correct?
That's correct, and obviously the next question is, what happens in 2019?
You just kick the can down the year, go another year.
We have
Could
another
the
meeting
same
like
discussion
this.
next year.
Well, hopefully some
Well,
of this.
we
hopefully some-
eliminate the amount that we've overtaxed our citizens, and then we address the issue at the time that we get to that point.
Hopefully we start collecting some revenue on this 80.5 million in new assets that we just, real estate assets that we just,
Now, that's a 1% tax increase,
So-
revenue increase, right?
Right,
Which
so
isn't enough to equal.
we're not gonna generate $600,000 of new tax revenue.
So, moving on, you can see one of the major factors that we're up against as we develop the budget. Next slide, Tom.
Yeah, but we will generate like $250,000.
Significant.
There was some material in the packet relative to an inquiry originally raised by Alderman Worth regarding the legality of fund balance. And this was based on some research that he was doing earlier in the year, where he ran across a 1987 opinion from the Wisconsin Attorney General on the legality of fund balance and the ability of municipalities to aggregate excess funds. And in the materials in your packet, the local governments in the opinion may not lawfully, quote, create and accumulate unappropriated funds. This matter was referred to the Finance and Personnel Committee in May. There was an attorney, a memo, from the city attorney addressing Alderman Worth's inquiry. And the city attorney in his memo indicated that as a general rule, municipalities in Wisconsin may not accumulate large excess surpluses. They may retain some reserves per industry recommendations or as a sound financial practice to address cash flow or emergency needs. And he did not believe that the city's current reasonable reserves violated the law referenced in the Attorney General's 1987 opinion. One of the challenging factors or complicating factors relative to this matter is there's very little, if no, case law on what constitutes an appropriate reserve amount here in Wisconsin.
Well, that's because the cases say, there are cases, and they say you shouldn't have reserves. You don't have to allocate every last dollar. There could be some carryover from year to year, but you're not supposed to appropriate more than you need to expend in a year. That's what the case law says. In fact, one case was a challenge of a swimming pool. And the city had money in reserve, sitting in a reserve fund. They reallocated it towards a pool fund. And then once they reallocated the pool fund, the court said, well, that's fine because that's actually allocated for a purpose. But it might not have been before that when it was an unallocated fund. I still think there is case law that suggests that you can't have unallocated reserves. And from the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The fact that the industry has decided to kind of ignore that and say, well, we've got, and the city attorney has some general principles, nothing on point that may support the position that you can. I still question whether it's legal.
Well, every community has one.
Oh, here we go.
What?
Kathleen.
Pretty much every community has.
Sure, because nobody's challenged it.
Right.
But you have to look at what is responsible fiscal policy.
But let's talk about that, because we always want to refer to things like some association suggests you ought to have 2 months. And that you even read the associations thing, and it talks about it ought to be key. Now, they say you ought to have 2 months. But they say communities ought to target it based on their own circumstances. Are you likely to have hurricanes? Are you likely to have, and nobody has ever in this body, in the 14 years I've heard this debate, ever suggest what we need it for, other than Moody's, which kind of followed up our entire economy, has suggested that it's a good idea.
But does it not affect our ability to borrow money at a reasonable rate?
When we were down to 6%, we still borrowed money almost cheaper than anybody else did, even though we had a negative outlook, because you have to look at the community's individual situation. We're a very solvent community. We're a community that if an emergency happened, which nobody can really define what that might be, but if we had one and we had to increase taxes the next year to cover it, we could quite easily. It's not like we're in a community, a blue-collar community that would cause this major catastrophe for its citizenry if you had that. And we're a community that can borrow money like that if we really needed to. So somebody explain to me what it is we need it for, other than we're taking a bunch of our constituents' money, we're putting it in a fund that we say we can never touch. We're never gonna use it. We can't even use it as a reserve. You know, we're gonna just have it sit there from now to the end of time. And we've got all these sinking funds, or we have other money that's on reserve for individual purposes that frankly we could borrow against in a true emergency also.
And we have.
There is no good justification for it other than Moody says it's a good idea. Now, I think we need to do some because it is the industry standard. But do we need to be at 14% or 16% or 18%? Nobody can tell me why.
No.
There's just no good reason for it. All we've done is taken today's taxpayer money, today's taxpayers, taken their money, put it in a bank account and said, we're gonna take your money and we're not gonna use it for anything.
Yeah,
That's wrong.
And in
Actually, it's
30
previous
years,
year's tax
Oh,
bill,
yeah.
because we're-
over
Oh, yeah.
30 years,
Every
we've
year.
never
Yeah.
used it for anything.
Yeah. We
The
just
one
stole money from
emergency
them.
we had, we borrowed money.
So I think we need a quantitative answer from somebody on this.
Well, our auditor says our policy is just fine. We don't need to increase the amount that we put in there, and
No, but can we
Moody's
de-
says we do. He says Moody's always says that
Yeah.
about everything.
But John is saying, can we decrease it to 10%?
Well, no, that is our policy. Our policy says 10%.
Our policy
Well,
says 10%.
But, okay, well, I would
It's the
say.
staff doesn't want us
it's
to
at
do,
four-
because of these other, and I'm not being critical there, because these other people recommend it, but there's no justification other than somebody in a book said it's a good idea.
But the fact is, we have used it, though. We've used 1.3 million of it in the last 3 years alone. So it's not like we never use it.
No, we used the excess. We
No.
didn't bring it down below 10%, have we?
So I think it's relative. We don't, staff doesn't see that as excess. We think of that as,
There's a bottleneck coming.
as prudent financial planning going forward. We're playing the game, obviously, with Moody's or Standards and Poor's, but for an, community R rating, every other community's got twice as much as Mequon.
And can you show us a situation where because of that, they got better interest rates? And how much were those better interest rates? Can you show us when we borrowed, we did borrow the year we had a 6% reserve, and they set a negative outlook. Can you show us that we would have gotten a lower interest rate because of that? Give me something to hang my hat on as opposed to staff feels this way.
Especially now, when the interest rates are lower, even if the rating did change, what does it change, an 8%?
Yeah.
Doesn't,
It's gonna be
Cost is infinite.
12.5 to 25 basis points, a quarter point now, but when rates start going back up, there's gonna be a lot bigger spread.
when they go back up.
Rating agencies look at us as,
Not adding to
in
savings.
in the year 2017, how hard is it for the city to have the financial discipline to raise taxes? And we could say we could do that, but they look at that as saying, how likely would you be to do it?
In an
That's a-
emergency, what is it for?
It's a
for
lot harder
emergencies.
to raise taxes in 2018 than it is in 2008 because of all the stuff that's gone on institutionally in government with citizen involvement, with stakeholder groups and things like that. So it's a slippery slope.
And most of those other communities have much higher debt than we do.
Yeah.
A lot of TIF debt, which could be a problem for them. And they have much higher tax rates to start with.
And much lower wealth and much lower property value. I mean,
So,
there's just, if we're going to live by our policy, let's go to our policy. We can have a minimum of 10. If it happens to eke up higher, we can keep it there if for some reason it's a good idea. But, you want to make us have a minimum of 15. Or whatever we happen to have now. And to the extent we expend any of it, we now have
I don't-
reduced it.
I
That's
don't
not
think
true.
I heard that from staff tonight.
I think the cautionary tale here is it's decreasing, it's not going up. We're not adding to it year over year, we're drawing from it.
We've added
We're
to
likely
less.
to, we're likely to draw, in recent history, the last few years, we've actually drawn from it. In the past, we've budgeted, but not actually needed to take it, we've actually added a little back, but the last few years, we've actually drawn it down. This, next year, I'm hearing we're likely to draw it down. We budgeted 700, it's likely to be 5 or 6. If we do it the next year, sooner or later, you're gonna hit the 10%. We have to really decide, is 10% the right number? And sure, let's have a debate on that. Maybe it's entirely reasonable. I don't know. Let's save that for another evening. But the trend isn't going up. We're not actively adding to it the last few years. It's going down. Sooner or later, we'll hit that number. We thought we were going to hit it this last year. Maybe we'll get lucky and undershoot spending a little bit. And maybe next year we will hit it. But sooner or later, we're going to hit it, I think is the message I heard.
Right?
Maybe.
So,
And then when you hit it, are you going to blow past it? Are you going to go,
well, I don't think 10% is the right number. I think for a
Okay,
community like
well-
ours, 3 to 5%, maybe 6% is a good number. It gives you some reserves to do something if you need to. But we don't need to address that because we're well above 10%.
fine, let's have a debate on, let's have another meeting on what the right number is. But sooner or later, we'll hit that too. Maybe it'll just be another year or two.
That'd be great if we.
It's gonna get really hard, it's gonna get really hard when interest rates actually start going up. We'll just be digging into, well, easy to say, but if you haven't,
I'd be happy to
if you haven't
re-agree on
planned in
that
advance
percentage.
for that exit strategy, which I think this whole meeting is about, then you're making decisions in real time. You're not planning, you're reacting. I think this meeting's about planning.
Correct.
So that when that does happen,
What do you think?
in a year, 2, 3, we're starting to turn the ship around already.
So that deals with the legality. These are just excerpts from the 2 best practices that were included in your packet regarding achieving a structurally balanced budget. And I won't spend any time on this, but fund balance guidelines for the general fund. Let's keep moving. Okay, so now we're going to move into the last couple of slides relative to staff's presentation. We talked about some of the other considerations that we wanted to bring to your attention here as we kick off the budget planning process. What we know is that Wisconsin retirement system, the contribution rate for 2018 is generally going to be flat. For general employees such as Lena, myself, and Tom, the number's actually going down marginally,
0.1%.
0.1%, but for protective service employees like police and fire, it's going up 0.2%. So we think that's going to be a wash. Average workers' comp rates here in Wisconsin, I think, are reducing by 8%. So that's going to be a positive development. Just by way of edification purposes, the city's tax rate, combined sewer and property tax rate, remains the 6th lowest in Wisconsin of cities with a population of 15,000 or more. And we have about $1 million of unused levy capacity, should we need it in any year for an emergency or for some capital needs that the council decides they might want to address. And as we talked about last year as we went through the budget process, a 1-cent adjustment to the tax rate is equivalent to about $45,000 of recurring revenue. What we know is coming on the screen, city attorney's contract is up, and the fire association, the Mequon Fire Association contract expires on December 31st. So we'll be kicking off negotiations with them here in the 3rd quarter. We have a merit pay plan system coming, and that will be online as of January 1st, 2018. It's likely going to be the reality that if we move to a merit pay system, we're going to be having some costs that are above just the CPI, which is what we've been using to benchmark salary adjustments on a year-over-year basis. Completion of asset management studies, we talked about that. That'll be 1st quarter of 2018. And what we don't know yet is what our health insurance premium adjustment is going to be and where things fall relative to the impact of the Affordable Care Act or its repeal or some version thereof relative to the fire department. You'll recall we budgeted, I think, $50,000 in the budget to account for that here in 2017. With the election results late in 2016, obviously everything is up in the air.
We as a community took advantage of Act 10 in a very modest way. We could create more dollars available for the merit pay plan system by using Act 10 to reduce our base labor costs, but then have a greater dollar amount that could be used for bonuses, just a thought. And, but my real question, where do you find the list of the lowest? We used to be either first or second, so if 4 cities passed us up, it'd be interesting to see who those were and
I think it depends where you look, but I looked at the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance website.
okay.
And for the latest year available, we are number 6. Previously, we're number 5.
Because I believe 10 years ago, it used to say in our budget that villages and cities, we were, of our size, we were the second lowest in the state.
I don't recall, but they kind of handicap us because they include the sewer rate as well as the general rate to get to a composite rate that they compare.
Here's a slide that you've seen previously. I think we shared it with you last year. This is our breakdown on full-time equivalents within the general fund. Currently, we have 51.12 full-time equivalents in both police and fire, and that's a crooked number, 51.12. But the administrative assistant in the fire department she works 5 hours a day, so she's equivalent to 62.5% of an employee, and that's why we get that crooked number there. But you can see public safety comprises a majority of, or at least half, of all of the city employees on a full-time basis. In public works, excluding the sewer division employees, we have 33 full-time and part-time employees. And then all of the other departments, finance, community development, the administrator's office, human resources, the assessment function, the clerk's office is comprised of 19.25 employees. So we weight heavily towards public safety, which is in line with our priorities. But if you start looking at efficiencies or reducing staff to meet certain thresholds relative to the development of the budget, we are pretty skinny here and we're pretty skinny here. We can certainly look at that, but that's just going to create a higher workload for the existing staff if we were to reduce headcount or eliminate positions. So, not making any value judgments here tonight, but these are the numbers before us. These are the numbers that are in the 2017 budget. You can find these in the personnel schedule in the 2017 budget. Next slide. So, we've kind of run through a lot here tonight, and really what we're hoping to get from the council tonight is policy direction relative to roads, capital financing, and the fund balance. And these are sort of the 6 points that Tom and I came up with as we were putting the finishing touches on this presentation here tonight. Are we in a position where we'd like to continue with the road borrowing program into 2018, recognizing that that's going to have an impact on the operating budget because more borrowing means more debt service, which means finding a way to fit that into the budget like we did last year? Or are we amenable to maybe taking a pause for 2018? And listening to the discussion around the room here tonight, I think I'm hearing that you probably need some more information in order to make that decision relative to what the service level impacts would be on our road conditions if we were to call a timeout either for a year or 2. So, assuming we were able to come up with some more information, we might punt on that question here now. And really, there's no decision that needs to be made relative to debt management or capital financing here tonight, but we want to present these as part of the good process of long-term financial planning.
Does anybody here see a 2-year pause? I personally don't see more than if we went that route for a pause, I can't see going for more than a 1-year pause. Can anybody see a 2-year pause?
I don't know what, again,
Well, I know, but I
We
mean,
don't know what would happen to
I know, but, I mean, even a 1-year pause is, I'd be reluctant to do unless there were
1
some.
year or every other, depending on what the rating is.
Well, when we have more information, it
Yeah, I
can be
need more
reevaluated every year.
All right, so we'll endeavor to bring back more information on what a 1- and a 2-year scenario would look like relative to our road ratings.
But if you do pause, we would still continue with the maintenance of the roads.
Right.
Correct.
Correct.
Yeah, so let's make that very clear.
And whatever we decide going forward, is there any consensus or support for separating maintenance from actual improvements and getting to a model or a situation or an approach whereby we're not borrowing and paying interest to do crack sealing and sealing of the roads?
If we
Most-
can, that's a great
That would-
idea.
That's a good idea.
Makes sense.
Because
Makes
it's
sense.
not an asset per se.
Right.
Okay,
We should go back to doing what we used to do, ideally.
Yeah.
okay. In terms of capital financing, is there interest in looking at a more detailed model to convert to a pay-as-you-go approach for roads? Now, we gave you a very preliminary analysis. It's not back of the napkin. Tom spent a lot of time putting this together, but it doesn't maybe have the level of sophistication relative to some of the information from engineering and road ratings, and it doesn't probably have the high-level fiscal analysis and long-term costing that we would get from our financial advisor, Ellers. Is there value in spending some time, whether it coincides with our budget process here for 2018 or it even extends beyond that, to looking at this as possibly a creative way to funding roads and getting more bang for our buck?
Well, I think, yes, I mean, I think that we ought to have pay-as-you-go at least for some level of what we expect to be annual reconstruction. If all of a sudden you're gonna redo Port Washington Road or Mequon Road or something, we don't do Mequon Road.
We're not gonna
but,
do those.
You know, you have some major thing, you may borrow for that in the future. But if you know that you're gonna spend $1 million every single year, it'd be better if that came out of pay-as-you-go rather than borrowing for it, since it's a steady and consistent expenditure
That we could plan for.
that you can plan for. So,
So there's interest in seeing what a more developed model or a scenario would look like?
sure.
Yeah.
For needed services, right?
Bless you.
Okay, and which planning scenario? I think we answered that question. I think there's maybe, reading the tea leaves, support for a 1 year, but we'll also look at what a 2-year program would look like. And then fund balance. I think there was some discussion regarding the appropriate target. Tom, I know you're in a position where you're gonna be bringing actually some of the financial policies to the Finance and Personnel Committee meeting beginning next month. I think one of the first policies is our fund balance policy for further discussion, review, and deliberation.
Right, so we haven't taken a really good look at a lot of our policies in years, so I'm gonna start that over again. Start with the easy, low-hanging fruit like fund balance. So,
Might as well just bring it to the committee of the whole meeting, right?
well, I thought we could work in a committee and get them to a point that they'd be ready for additional set of eyes. It's your choice. You wanna take everyone's time to go through the policies, or you wanna have a
I would
handful?
think something as big as fund balance is something that in the long term has such a major impact on our budget that it really ought to be the appropriations committee that looks at it rather than finance personnel. Because you're just going to get the viewpoint of 3 aldermen and not the input from everybody else. But,
Well, everything a committee does goes before the common council.
I know.
It'd be by
But
resolution.
is there
We'll
any
set it
longer-
up and you can swing at it.
I'd rather have it at committee of the whole and have just the concept crafted before it comes to finance and personnel, just to make sure it goes through the appropriate
Then
channel.
it doesn't need to go to
the
finance.
Yeah, that doesn't need to go there.
Either way, we're gonna be at the meeting.
Yeah, yeah. Either way, we get to
We
decide.
have about, what, 10 financial policies?
So it's up to you guys.
I think a lot of it
This one seems to be particularly
We have over a
of
dozen
interest to
policies.
people, however, the group.
They can all come to the
It's been
meeting.
a sticking point in every
Yeah.
budget I've been in on.
You
What's
can't all
best,
come
what's
if you have
not.
other committee meetings, though, then we better not schedule any at the same time.
Right.
So would you like to have that discussion as part of the appropriations committee meeting process in connection with the budget? Or do you want to have this at a committee of the whole meeting during a council meeting? Because I can tell you the parking study is coming in August. The police and fire staffing studies are coming in September. and there may be other chunky committee of the whole discussions as well, and we could certainly ladle up that agenda, but it's gonna mean some long meetings. And we've got some development projects in the queue as well that I think are gonna require some discussion.
Except this is a $500,000 to $1 million issue. At least it has been almost every single year that I've been on the council. I mean, there's, almost every year there's been an argument about fund balance. It seems to me to be a pretty big policy, directive. And, you can do whatever you want to finance personnel, but we're gonna have that same argument once it gets to the council. I'm just wondering what the point is of having it.
Well,
earlier.
given that we've got a gaping hole in fund balance, and that may be part of the discussion for addressing and ultimately adopting the 2018 budget, might it make sense to conjoin the fund balance policy discussion with the council's consideration of the budget? Because it may come into play and may influence the outcome that you arrive at, or are comfortable with arriving at.
That makes sense.
Does that make sense?
To me.
Okay. Can we do that?
Actually, I don't share the same viewpoint. To be fair, I think we should have that conversation before we present a budget to the council or the committee. That fund balance should be baked in, that discussion should be baked into the budget that we bring to the appropriations committee.
Why don't you let it go to committee, and then it'll come to the council, and you can pretend it's a committee of the whole, because it will be.
All right, we'll suspend the rules and
We'll set
have
it
the
up,
fight.
you can swing at it.
That's fine.
Okay. And then lastly, we've got this structural deficit that we pointed out relative to the $700,000 in fund balance. What direction would you like staff to take away from tonight in terms of preparing the 2018 budget? We've got to make up that $700,000 hole. We're going to have some inflationary pressures relative to contract adjustments for police, the cost of certain supplies such as salt or what have you, possibly a health insurance adjustment. Do you want us to look at cuts? Do you want us to look at fund balance? Do you want us to look at tax rate, or some combination thereof? I know that's kind of an open-ended question, but what
I don't know how we're
is,
gonna determine that in the next 10 minutes.
well,
We don't have the numbers to answer that question.
Yeah.
We probably won't hire nearly as many consultants next year, so, because we hired so many this year,
I hope to God.
that we'll probably save a fortune.
Maybe that's what we should have a one-year hiatus on, is consultants.
Consultants.
10-year.
2 year.
well, just as a reminder, last year, we were instructed to bring back a budget with a 0% increase,
That's always a good objective.
and to absorb the debt service for the new DPW facility. And we went through a process that was not easy and resulted in, I think it was almost $400,000 in recurring expenditure cuts. But we also laid out a rather extensive menu of other options for the council to consider. And when it all came down to it, the council was in a position where you added back a number of the cuts that were identified and arrived at. So,
But also the new DPW building resulted in a number of savings,
Is it really?
Oh, sure. Well, you closed down 2 buildings, and then if you want to add the Logan Center the way you
We've
did.
yet to realize them because they haven't actually hit.
Yeah, they haven't hit
Well,
the
then
operating
there's
part of the operating
we're
budget.
purchasing salt in a different way than we used to, and we're saving money there.
See what those numbers are.
Need to see what it is,
Yeah,
yeah.
Dr. Watson.
Is there any tolerance to any kind of a tax rate increase? Can I hear that?
Not as an initial suggestion from the staff, but it may be that at the end of the day,
Okay.
that's what ends up happening, just like last
Right.
year.
Yeah.
I'm hoping it doesn't happen, but
Yeah, I would say
maybe,
bring the 0 budget and we take a look at it.
and
we
give us
see-
options.
and does a 0 budget include some use of fund balance potentially from the staff perspective?
Well, I think
Yeah, one vote.
we haven't discussed the policy yet, but it sounds like we're gonna have a discussion on the 10%. If
And
we're
by
sitting
that
at
time, we'll know.
14, I would say that probably expect that the general consensus would be
Use
take
it.
it down to 10 at a
Right.
minimum, and we'll see what the final number is, Regis.
So staff has that flexibility and
Within the policy that exists.
within the existing
We have
policy.
a current policy.
So what you're gonna do, last year what we did is you brought back the zero fund balance, and then there was add backs into it, and then we turned around and said, all right, we're gonna take money from the general fund to go into it. Are you gonna bring us a zero fund, and then we're gonna decide whether we're gonna do the add backs, or are you gonna just make yours a zero balance
That's a good
by
question.
using the general fund?
That's
Yeah, we
what-
raise taxes.
Well, we raised taxes, but we also took from the general fund. They didn't make that
Yeah, we
recommendation to
took-
begin with.
They took some and we took more,
Yeah.
right?
They took 3 and we took the rest, I think.
Were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I think we started with 300,000, we ended up at 700,000 worth of fund balance. If we came up with a budget that used 4.1% of fund balance to get us to 10, and then gave you a list of what's not funded, is that what I'm hearing you'd like to see?
Why don't you give us one that gives you zero balance when you guys use 300, just like last year?
Okay,
Okay.
so, for example, a police officer is 2 cents, so a new hire. Is that something that is on the wish list?
Yeah, well, you didn't really lay that out here for what the wish list is, but, which is somewhat surprising. Discussion of, are there things that we think we need?
September.
All right, so I'm hearing some use of fund balance, show us 0% rate increase, show us a list of what's not programmed in the budget.
Right, we said 300 use of fund balance. Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, next slide. These are our next steps, and I think I kind of touched on these at the outset. Departmental budget requests are due at the end of August. We'll complete our meetings with the department heads the week of Labor Day. The police and fire staffing analysis right now are scheduled to come before the council at a committee of the whole meeting on September 12th. We're hoping to make that deadline, and we've been pushing the consultants to stay on track. The proposed budget will be posted October 6th, and then we've laid out a number of dates which we think are generally in line with availability and do not conflict with like a planning commission meeting or some other meeting of the council, and gets us to the point where we would have a budget that we could publish by October 24th, which is our deadline per statute. So we're looking to maybe get 1 or 2 or 3 dates agreed to here tonight. I know Thursdays are kind of out there for some people, but if we want to get an earlier start on the budget and not leave it right until, say, Tuesday,
Really
October.
anticipating 5 meetings?
No,
No,
no.
just one.
We're just giving you these choices.
These are possible dates.
That's what I thought.
I'd say
Why?
Tuesday, because that's the day Dale can come.
Yeah, I mean, why not post the budget October 5th and have October 6th, which is that a Tuesday? Or the Tuesday before, whatever is up there. Where's the 10th of October?
Tuesday
That's
the
a
10th,
council
that's
meeting.
council night.
Oh, good point. I just, Dale can't, he makes Tuesday evenings. I think it,
Tuesday is the only day he can come,
yeah,
isn't it?
he works evenings.
So if we planned on Tuesday, October 17th at 6 o'clock, there's nothing stopping this council from going as late as you need to. But if there were some points of information or decisions that had to be kicked over, really your only other dates for considering that at that point would be Thursday, the 19th, or Monday, the 23rd. So if we're comfortable with that, we could identify the preliminary or the primary date of Tuesday, October 17th. But I think for good planning purposes, we'd want to have a backup date in case we need it,
Or I
like
think we should leave all 3 of those nights,
all 3?
17th, 19th, 23rd, and, I mean, just calendar them in case we need them. But the odds are we only need the 1 or the 2.
Okay.
Yeah, we used to take 3 whole nights to do it. It was brutal.
We've done it in one,
We've done it.
numerous times.
An hour, yeah.
Right.
Is there a desire to go back to 3 nights?
No.
No, 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 no,
Horrible.
no. No, not necessary.
Long, drawn-out presentations.
Okay, so we'll endeavor to maybe get this done in one night.
Good.
And if we need a second night, we need a second night, and we'll have to make it work.
We've also done, I believe, an appropriations meeting before the council meeting, at least one year, where we needed to come back and have fine-tune the discussion further, because we didn't have a recommendation going into the council meeting, which is one other option.
I mean, we've only put certain nights or days of the week and times up here. I mean, we didn't look at Saturday mornings, but if push came to shove, I'm seeing no's, so we'll stay off Saturdays. All right, so we'll calendar those 3 dates. We'll include those in the weekly bulletin, just as a reminder for everyone this week. And we're gonna get trotting on the 2018 budget, and we'll be back before you here in no time.
Move
'Cause
to
it's-
adjourn.
It's gonna go fast.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Adjourn.
My favorite motion of every night.
Thank you for your time.
Good meeting. Lot better, good meeting, lot better meeting than the one last year with the clicker.